Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I had a little bit of a noise coming from my driver front suspension. I figured out that it was those IWEs, which is a vacuum actuated hub for the 4x4 system in these trucks. So I decided to go ahead and replace it. But while I'm in there, I'm also going to replace the CV axles and the wheel bearings, and I'll show you all of that in this video. I'll also show you some of the things that you should not do to prevent you from having issues like I did. This is going to be pretty straightforward, so let's jump right in. First, you need to put your truck on jack stands and remove the wheel of whatever side you're working on. We are going to start with the driver's side first. Once that's removed and out of the way, look for these two bolts. One is an 8mm and the other is a 10mm. Those need to be removed to give yourself some slack in the ABS line. This is your IWE vacuum line, which will need to be disconnected from the IWE. Oh, and in case you were wondering, IWE stands for Integrated Wheel End. This line runs from your ABS wheel speed sensor in your wheel bearing up this way to the top of the wheel liner, and we will remove that later in the video. And yes, if you purchase new wheel bearings, they do come with this line, so you don't have to remove the sensor itself. Let's start with a 10mm bolt that holds the brake hose bracket in place. This will give you plenty of room to push that brake caliper out of the way after removing it. Alright, that bolt is off, and now you should be able to pull the bracket out. Do you see this part of the bracket that extends out? This helps hold the line in place when we put everything back together. I'll show you what I mean later in the video. Push that out of the way and then get ready to disconnect the bolt for the ABS line. This is an 8mm. For this bolt, I'm going to use an open-ended wrench. You can use a socket, however, it's difficult to get one in there because of how close this rubber clamp is to the bolt. Once that is free, the line will have more slack in it, just like this. You can remove the rest, but I'm going to stop there because I don't want the line to constantly get in the way while I'm working. We will get back to it in a little bit. Alright, now we're going to start spraying bolts and nuts down with some penetrating fluid. Pretty much anything you see on the back side here, including this nut on the tie rod end, needs to be sprayed down to make removal a lot easier. But the fluid can't penetrate if there's a lot of dirt and rust everywhere, like on my truck. So what I'm going to do is grab my brake cleaner and spray down these parts. Then I'll grab my wire brush to help remove some of that rust that may prohibit the penetrating fluid from, well, penetrating. Little side note here, make sure you are wearing safety glasses or something to protect your eyes, as well as a mask to prevent breathing in rust particles that will inevitably fly in the air. While I'm cleaning the other side, now is a good time to show you the different size sockets you will need. I've also included how many are on each side, which again I will show you later in the video. As you can see, there are 3 8mm IWE bolts, 1 21mm tie rod nut, 4 18mm wheel bearing bolts, and finally 2 21mm caliper bracket bolts. There's also a 21mm upper control arm nut that is not in view. Once you are done using the wire brush, spray some brake cleaner on the nuts and bolts one more time and then wait for it to dry. Once dry, you can grab your penetrating fluid and start soaking each nut and bolt. Make sure your can is upright or else it may start spraying like this. There we go, that's better. I'm also going to spray a little bit on the top of the tie rod right here. These tie rods can be a pain getting loose, which you will see in a little bit. Don't forget to spray the bolts on the other side as well as the upper control arm nut. While that's soaking, let's get this cap removed so we can have access to the axle nut. Most people use a flathead and jam it into the sides of the cap. However, I'm going to show you how to remove it with channel locks. I'm going to be installing a new cap, but if you need to reuse yours, this is a better way of removing the cap compared to jamming a flathead into the side. You want to keep moving around the cap while rocking the channel locks back and forth. Eventually, the cap will come loose and pop right out. Just like that. This is an old cap, and as you can tell, the inside edge has 0 damage, so it can be reused again. The outside has some dents in it from the channel locks, but that's okay. This is in great shape to be reused. However, caps are cheap, and I decided to replace them anyway. So here are the caps, and the part number for my truck is 9L1Z1131A. I believe these can be used for a wide variety of F150s that have 4-wheel drive. Now let's remove that axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt, and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it, so I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. This should loosen it a little at a time until you can grab the top of the rotor to hold it in place as you loosen the nut the rest of the way. Eventually, it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it, just like that. You will notice the inside nut has red Loctite on the threads. Make sure your new nut has it too, as this will prevent the nut from loosening over time, which could cause severe damage to parts around this area. So, here are the new axle nuts. The kit comes with 2 of them. And the part number for my truck is N802827S100A4X. Now let's move on and get the caliper out of the way. I'm going to remove the caliper as one unit by removing these two bolts for the caliper mounting bracket. These are 21mm. Make sure you start with the lower bolt first, or else the caliper will move too much at the top, making it difficult to keep it stable while removing the bottom bolt due to the weight of the caliper. Once that's removed, we can move on to the top bolt. Now you do not want to completely remove this bolt until you find an area to rest the caliper, or until you are ready to mount the caliper out of the way safely without it dangling from the brake hose. I took mine out and screwed it back in until I was ready. I used these bungee cords to start, but quickly found out I needed something a little more stable to keep pressure off of that brake hose. You will see that in a bit. So I rested the caliper on the top of the hub and removed the rotor. Make sure you rest the rotor on something soft if you plan on reusing them. Now back to hanging the caliper. This would definitely be easier with caliper hooks, or if there's another person available to hold it while you feed a bungee or rope around it. Here is how it looks at this stage. As you can see, with this bracket detached from the mounting point, we have enough slack in the brake hose to push the caliper as far back as possible. This gives us plenty of room to get to the parts we need to remove. But I do not like the way the caliper looks with one bungee cord. So here is a revision I did off camera. As you can see, I have both of these hooks securing the caliper to the sway bar back here. This provides plenty of support as it does not move very much. Now let's remove the tie rod nut so our hub can freely move side to side. This is a 21mm. You might as well remove it all the way with your socket wrench or your impact, because it will be too difficult to remove by hand due to the Loctite used from the factory. Once that's out of the way, you can grab a sledgehammer or a regular hammer and start hitting right here. This should technically help break the tie rod free. However, as you can see, my tie rod wanted to be a little difficult. I was hitting it with some decent force too, but the bushing would not break free. I even tried hitting this part of the tie rod, which you should never do as it can twist the rod and cause damage to the bushing. And you also don't want to hit the bottom like this, because that could mushroom the end and make it difficult to get that nut back on. So I stopped with the risky methods and decided to try something different. I grabbed some penetrating fluid and sprayed right here where the bushing meets the hub. I also sprayed the threads underneath the knuckle, however I'm not sure that did a lot. The fluid on top I believe was the most helpful. I'm going to let that soak in for a bit, but I want you to take note of the wheel position. Now the wheel is turned the other way as I needed more access to these bolts. I'll show you why that is important in a second. Let's get those IWE bolts removed. These are 8mm. After that's removed, you can move on to the second of the 3 IWE bolts. But wait, now the tie rod is popped out of place. I believe it popped when I turned the wheel when trying to access that IWE bolt. Let's get the other 2 IWE bolts out of the way. This is where both of them are located, and remember they are 8mm. That's the second bolt. And there's the third. Now you have to pull the vacuum line out of the IWE and it's completely free. Well, sort of. You can see the axle move, but the IWE is stuck due to all the rust. So I grabbed my sledgehammer again and gave it a few taps. You can see the rust flying off the back with each hit. Now the IWE is free from the hub. So we should be able to pull it straight out now, right? Well, not quite. You can't just pull back on the CV axle and remove the IWE. As you can see right here, it doesn't pull back far enough. It doesn't matter how hard you try to push it away from the hub, it is not possible to remove. So, you need to remove the upper control arm nut so you can move the hub away from the axle. You'll see what I mean shortly. Removing this nut was not very easy for me. Oh, and you definitely need to buy new nuts to replace these like I had to. More on that in a bit. This nut is a 21mm, and if you have an air gun, I would definitely use that. Just make sure you spin that nut off as quickly as possible without stopping, or else you will run into the same issue I did. I even tried to use my battery operated impact on the passenger side, however I still ran into issues. If you do what I'm doing, at some point the bolt that goes through the bushing will start spinning with the nut. That's not good, but I did find out what needs to be done in order to get them separated. At the bottom right here, you can use a socket to hold that bolt in place. I believe mine was 10mm. Then you can grab a 21mm open-ended wrench and begin loosening the nut. I'm using channel locks, which you can use to get this done. However, I would definitely recommend using a 21mm open-ended wrench. After removing the nut, the sides were in rough shape. If you are replacing yours, which you should, then it doesn't matter what you use to remove it. At some point, you won't have to hold both wrenches, as you can see here. The bottom wrench is pushing against the spring in the back as I'm turning the nut with the channel locks. While this does help, I still had a hard time turning the nut, so I decided to try something else. I grabbed my electric impact and tried to spin the nut off, but the whole thing just spun together. Then I tried to use a crowbar. First I pried up, which was the wrong way, and again, the nut would not break free. Next, I pried the correct way by putting downward pressure on the control arm. This did not work, but I did notice the control arm wasn't pressing down as much as I expected. So I thought if I adjusted where the jack stands were, maybe this would help me get the right amount of pressure onto the control arm to help me remove that nut. As you can see, the jack stand was right here holding the whole hub assembly up. Watch the hub assembly drop as I relocate the jack stand. Now with the jack stand back here, the hub will drop several more inches. At the time, I thought this was going to help. I was also wrong again for the 19th time. Oh, and if you are interested in a 2-in-1 jack and jack stand like this one right here, I'll leave the information for it in the description below. I've been using this one for years and it makes working on my truck a lot easier. It's smaller than a regular floor jack and doubles as a jack stand with its locking bracket. And no, I am not sponsored by this company, I just really like this jack. However, if Powerbuilt wants to collab, I guess we could do so. Moving on. Remember when I said this wasn't going to work? Well, here's the footage. No matter how much downward force I applied, the nut was not budging. So I caved and decided to get some heat. I bought this torch and it worked like a charm. However, it did take some time to get it hot enough to remove. Also, using the impact did not work. Just watch this. Even while I was applying a lot of force, the nut would not budge enough. And this wasn't a situation where the nut just wasn't hot enough. As you can see, I tried this several times and it did not come off. So I had to go back to the wrench and channel lock method, and this worked perfectly. There was still resistance while trying to unscrew it, but I was finally able to completely remove it. Here's the nut. These are also known as an insulator nut, and the reason for that is because they come with a plastic ring at the end to help keep the bolt from backing out. Here's a picture of a brand new nut from Ford. See that red ring at the end? That's what I'm referring to. That plastic piece is what makes removing that upper control arm nut so difficult. It's also why I was able to remove it after using heat, because I essentially melted the plastic and unscrewed it before it cooled off and became solid again. Let's keep going. Next, you want to get that ABS line loose and disconnected so you can completely remove the wheel bearing. So grab some kind of clip removal tool like this one and disconnect the line right here. Now on the center edge of your fender well, you will notice two white pins sticking out. You need to push these in or pull down on the electrical connector behind it just like that. There is a red tab you need to push out before you can disconnect. So grab your clip removal tool again, or even push it out with a fingernail if you can. Then you can disconnect the connector by pressing on this tab right here and then pulling them apart, just like that. The tab is right under this red clip. All you do is press down, pretty simple. Then you want to feed this wire through or pull it out of this area. And the only thing it should be connected to at this point is the wheel bearing. Now I did not get this on camera, but you need to disconnect the IWE vacuum line. That's simple, you just need to pull it right off. Nothing else to it. Since the upper control arm is disconnected from the hub assembly, you can easily pull it towards you like this and then push the IWE and CV axle to free them. Then the IWE should easily slide off of the CV axle like this. Let's take a closer look at that IWE. A good IWE will allow you to push the face in without restriction. Part of it will push in, but as you can see right here, this part will not. This tells me the IWE failed, which makes sense because of the noise I was hearing. This outer edge does not look like it held up well, meaning it could have let in moisture and debris. That seems to be the point of failure. It's quite odd that Ford still uses this design considering how many issues it presents to its customers, but that's a discussion for another video. Alright, let's grab the new IWE and compare it to the old one to make sure we have the right one. As you can see, it comes pre-greased from Ford, which is great. However, I will be adding a little bit more grease to help keep things lubricated, which you will see in a little bit. Also, it comes with new IWE 8mm bolts and a new axle nut. That's convenient, and it also means I need to run back to Ford to return the two axle nuts that I bought individually because I did not know this kit came with new ones. However, keep that in mind if you plan on replacing these. Now, this is as simple as putting both IWEs right next to each other and making sure they are exactly the same. You want to keep an eye on the nipples that the vacuum line mounts to, as well as the 3 tabs that the bolt screws in to hold the IWE in place. As I mentioned earlier, these things are greased up pretty good from the factory, so you don't have to worry about that. However, I will be adding more. One last thing before we continue. Take a look at how freely the new one presses down. There's definitely a difference. Now, if you were just replacing the IWE, you need to wipe down this end of the axle to remove the old grease. This is important because the old grease probably has a lot of dirt and other debris stuck in there that you really want to clean up to prevent from damaging your brand new IWE. I'm replacing my axle, but I still wanted to mention that. Now, if you follow the axle, you will see it connects right into your front differential. There aren't bolts holding it in, so it's kind of tricky to remove. The best and only way you should try to remove it is by pulling on the axle as straight as you can. It's going to feel like it isn't moving, which is normal. Do not use a crowbar. I saw a video of someone using one and decided to give it a try without researching the risks associated with using one. If you use too much pressure and break the C-clip at the end of the axle, you will be able to remove the axle. However, the C-clip will be stuck in your front differential, and if you don't remove it, you can cause damage to the front diff at some point. So you would then have to remove the cover on the front diff and do a complete fluid change while fishing that broken C-clip out of there. If you know anything about front differentials in these Ford trucks, you know it's very difficult to do this. Almost everyone would rather siphon the old fluid out of the front diff and then add fluid back in without removing the cover due to the degree of difficulty. So do yourself a favor and leave the crowbar alone. Now, if you are pulling and it just isn't budging, there is something you can do to loosen it up a bit. Grab your mallet or a hammer and bang on this part of the axle. This is not going to break the axle free from the diff, but it will break apart some of that rust that could be preventing that axle from moving as you are trying to pull it out. Eventually, you will notice it's slowly starting to move out. Just like that. Let's watch that again. As I'm pulling, you see the axle moving towards me. Do that until the axle pulls straight out. Oh, and you may need to put a catch can or a towel underneath just in case any fluid comes out. There shouldn't be a lot, if any at all. Now, in order to pull the axle out, you need to lift up first because this part is too wide to pull through your strut and end link. Perfect. Now we can get the wheel bearing out of there. So grab your 18mm socket and preferably a breaker bar and begin loosening the bolts that secure the bearing to the hub. I would advise you do this before removing the upper control arm nut. As you can see, it's kind of a pain trying to loosen while the hub is moving around like this. Or if you have an impact, you can use that instead. This makes removing these bolts a lot easier. Once those are removed, you can grab your mallet and start hitting the side of the wheel bearing since this is an open area, and you do not have to worry about damaging anything else near it. After a few whacks, the bearing should fall out. You can move the ABS line before hitting the wheel bearing, or after like I did. You're just going to have to feed it between the dust shield and the hub. Now you can compare the new bearing to the old one. Make sure you also check the connector to make sure they are identical. If yours look different, try flipping the new one around. Those look good. Also, remove the red cap and then we can start putting everything back together. Before we just throw the wheel bearing back in, we want to clean up this area a bit. So grab your brake clean and spray the hub down. Then take a metal wire brush and begin removing the dust and debris around the mating surface. If there's too much debris on part of the hub and you install the new bearing, it's possible you can feel some vibrations due to the wheel bearing being slightly lopsided. This is a pretty rare situation, however you still want to make sure you do what you can to prevent this from happening. And make sure you run your fingers around the surface to catch any high spots that you may need to use your wire brush on. This area needed more attention, so I grabbed my wire brush again. Once that's done, spray your brake clean one more time and then wipe it down. Now we can apply our grease to the mating surface. You don't have to apply a lot, just enough to help keep out moisture. Plus it helps the wheel bearing slide into place easier too, just like that. That's all we need. So grab your wheel bearing and slide it into place. Then grab one of your bolts and begin threading it in to keep the wheel bearing from moving. Oh, and one more thing I should mention. You need to apply thread locker to these bolts since this is a high vibration area and you do not want to risk having these bolts get loose over time. That would be pretty bad if you were on the highway and they loosened. I'll get back to this in a little bit. Go ahead and hand tighten all 4 bolts. Then you can grab a wrench in your 18mm socket and start tightening them down. The torque spec on these bolts are 129 foot-pounds. You will see me attempt to use a torque wrench on these bolts a little later, but I ran ran into an issue. Now you will notice there is a gap between the hub and bearing, but don't worry, once you get these bolts tightened down, that gap will close. Oh, and make sure you route your ABS line correctly, or else it may be difficult to move it later with these bolts torqued down. You also want to make sure you tighten these down in a crisscross pattern. Facing the hub, I tighten mine down as follows: top left, bottom right, bottom left, and finally top right. This will help keep the wheel bearing as flat as possible when sliding into the hub. Oh, and give the bearing a little spin just to make sure there aren't any weird noises coming out of it. Should probably do this before mounting it just in case you need to exchange it for another one. Now let's get that new axle installed. You are going to want to feed the axle this way to the right of the strut and to the left of the wire harness. Then push in and move it down so the axle is resting between the strut and end link, just like this. Then it's as simple as lining up the end with the hole in the differential and then trying to push it in as straight as you can. You will most likely not get it on the first try. This takes patience, as the grooves on the axle need to line up perfectly with the grooves in the diff. You can also try to rotate it clockwise and counterclockwise while pushing it in. This may help the grooves line up. Eventually it will push in like this, however that doesn't mean it is locked in. Do you see how loose this is? This means the grooves are lined up, but that C-clip hasn't settled into place yet. So we need to essentially do the exact same thing we were just doing, but we don't need to worry about rotating it. We are now focused on pushing in until we can't pull it out anymore. Just like that. Do you see how solid that looks? This isn't going to move, meaning the clip is settled and we can move on. Now grab your grease and you're going to want to apply it to the wheel bearing and your CV axle. Your new IWE will be sandwiched between these two parts, and since it already comes greased from Ford, you don't need to apply a lot of grease. Just a coating over the ends to ensure everything stays greased up while in operation. Once that's done, you can grab your IWE and make sure it's in the correct orientation. You want the nipples to face towards the vehicle, not out like you see here. Watch what happens when you have it facing the wrong way. Two things. First, it would be difficult to connect the vacuum line to the nipples. And secondly, you won't be able to mount it because the three 8mm bolts will not be able to reach the hub with the IWE out this far. So pull it back out. Mount the IWE properly and then push it back together. Okay, so while you are working on the next step, you need to find a way to keep the hub assembly from falling towards you. Since that upper control arm nut is out, it will naturally fall forward. So you can use a bungee, or you can temporarily put that nut back on the upper control arm ball joint to hold it into place. Now, grab some thread locker and apply it to each of the three bolts before you start screwing them in. Again, this is a high vibration area, and you don't want these bolts to back out. Then grab your 8mm socket and your torque wrench. Now I read online these need to be torqued down to 133 inch-pounds. However, my Chilton's manual reads 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going with 108 inch-pounds for now. If I need to go to 133, then I can always tighten them later. I don't want to risk going higher and being wrong, as this could break the bolts. Oh, and make sure you are using inch-pounds and not foot-pounds. 108 foot-pounds would definitely break them. The first two bolts, I'm going to just get them flush with the IWE. Then the third bolt I will torque down and do the same with the other two. When torquing down, you want to go slow. If you try to speed through it with a smaller torque wrench like this, it may not register, and then you could end up over torquing the bolts. There's one. There's two. And let's move over to the other side and torque the third bolt down. Just like that. Do you remember earlier when I mentioned the wheel bearing bolts need thread locker because it's in a high vibration area? Yep, I'm going to apply that right now. Like I said earlier, this is pretty important, so make sure you do it to prevent the bolts from potentially backing out. Alright, let's move on to the upper control arm nut. You need to use a pry bar or something similar to allow you to press the control arm down like this. This gives you the leverage needed to line up the hub assembly and get that nut screwed on. As I stated near the beginning of this video, it is required to replace this nut on both sides due to that red plastic piece that melted off when I was using a torch. I am installing the old ones, but I had to go back to Ford to get new nuts to replace later on. Make sure the pry bar is secure and doesn't come out like mine just did. Luckily, this did not cause any damage or injury, but it can fly out, so just be careful. With the pry bar secure against the spring, I was able to easily pull down and then screw the nut on. Once you feel the nut is threaded enough, go ahead and remove the bungee if you used one. Now we can tighten the nut. Ford calls for this to be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. However, that would be quite difficult to do since I don't have a 21mm open-ended wrench, so I'm just going to use my impact. Plus, I need to replace this bolt with a new one anyway. If you have a 21mm open-ended wrench, you need to wedge it up against the hub assembly right here while it's on the nut. Then you should be able to use a torque wrench with a socket and tighten from the bottom. I think that would be the best way to tackle that, but if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments and I'll add it to the description. Next, we need to grab one of our new axle nuts and begin screwing it onto the end of the axle that's poking through the center of the wheel bearing. Now we need to torque this nut down to 30 foot-pounds. While you are turning the axle nut, you will notice at some point the bearing begins to turn also, just like this. Now some people I've watched online will use a pry bar and wedge it between the wheel studs to keep it from moving. I personally don't like this idea because, as you may have guessed, you could damage the threads on the studs. So I decided to hold on to the studs while using a torque wrench with one hand. If you are unable to do this, you can ask someone to hold it, or if you have no other choice and need to use something like a pry bar, just make sure you wrap the threads completely with a towel, like a microfiber, to hopefully prevent any damage to the wheel studs. That can be done if you are very careful, but avoid it if you can. Alright, let's move on to something that is not necessary at all. I'm going to grab some grease and apply a decent amount around the axle nut. I'm not sure if I read somewhere this needed to be done, or if I was just used to doing it on older vehicles like my OBS F150, but I do know this can help keep moisture out, so I figured why not. Once that's done, we can move on to installing the cap. This is fairly simple, however, you need to pay attention to how you install it. You want to make sure it's perfectly straight before you start hammering it into place. You can use a mallet or a hammer, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's straight or else you may damage the inside edge, which would make it difficult for it to securely stay in place. This is how it should look when it's installed correctly. Now we just need to clean it up a bit and then we can move on. Perfect, just like that. We will get to the rotor in a second, but I want to mention now is a good time to put thread locker on the caliper bolts. If you try to do this while holding the caliper in place, you will find it quite difficult. These calipers are heavy and will move around on you, so it's best to be prepared before you get to it. Alright, let's apply our anti-seize to the hub surface to prevent the rotor from sticking the next time we have to remove it. You just want a light coat and do not add any to the wheel studs. If you get some on them, just wipe it off with a rag or a towel. Once that's completely covered, you can grab your rotor and push it over the wheel studs. Then grab your anti-seize again and apply it to this part of the rotor. You do not want to get any on the surface that your brake pads touch. This will make it difficult to stop, as you can imagine. Again, just a light coat is all you need. And if you get any on the wheel studs like I did, just go ahead, like I said earlier, wipe it off. Alright, now we need to get that caliper back on. Make sure you put one lug nut on to help keep the rotor in place to make this easier. I'll show you what I mean. Oh, and do not press on the surface of the rotor or else you will get anti-seize everywhere. As you can see, trying to keep that rotor pressed back while installing the caliper is a chore. You really need to use two hands to handle the caliper, which is why screwing on one lug nut is such a convenient idea. It will prevent that rotor from moving, which is exactly what you want. Eventually, I was able to get the caliper lined up with the bracket and started threading the bolts in. Remember, if you haven't added thread locker to these bolts yet, make sure you do so. Once they are threaded in, you can torque these down to 184 foot-pounds. I just use my impact to tighten these bolts because I'm pretty sure my torque wrench is broken or needs to be recalibrated. I'll show you what I mean. I went to torque down the 4 wheel bearing bolts to 129 foot-pounds, but something did not feel right. This is a pretty long torque wrench and I was able to spin these bolts without feeling any click to let me know it's properly torqued. Worried that I would snap the bolt in half, I stopped and tried the next bolt. Same thing happened. So I was pretty sure the torque wrench was not working properly. Regardless, make sure the 2 caliper bolts are torqued down to 184 foot-pounds and the 4 wheel bearing bolts are torqued down to 129 foot-pounds. Now we can connect that 10mm bolt for our brake hose bracket. Then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. Just like that. Next is your ABS line. So grab that and see if it reaches the bracket that it screws into. If it doesn't, like mine, then it's snagged onto something and you need to free it. Mine was snagged on the brake dust shield. Once I was able to free it, it gave me just enough slack to get that 8mm bolt finger tight. Then you can grab your socket and snug it down. Now you can grab the wire and connect it to the connector up top. After it's connected, go ahead and push in those 2 white clips through the fender liner just like this. Alright, so as you can see, the footage is rather dark at this angle, so I'm just going to fast forward this part and then I will show you exactly where the wire needs to be clipped into. Now as I grab the camera, you will see the first clip gets pushed into this bracket and the other clip gets pushed in right here. This is how the wire should look, but you can also take a picture of the stock setup before starting this job so you can use it as a reference. Let's move on and get that tie rod nut back on. Just grab your tie rod and then maneuver the hub assembly to allow the tie rod end to slot into place, just like that. Make sure you add some thread locker onto the threads too. Then grab your 21mm deep socket and torque this nut down to 85 foot-pounds. Now we can reconnect the IWE vacuum hose. Take note, there are two different size holes in the hose as you can see right here. This is to prevent you from putting it on in reverse. So go ahead and push it on. Then grab the clip for the hose right here and push it into the bracket just like this. That helps keep the hose in place so it doesn't move too much while driving. You can now put your wheel back on. Make sure you tighten the lug nuts in a crisscross pattern and then torque them down to 125 foot-pounds. Finally, you can lower your truck and then turn the wheel all the way to the left if you plan on working on the passenger side next. I already jacked up my truck and removed the wheel, so let's start by disconnecting the IWE vacuum hose. Just pull it off. Then we can begin working on that ABS line. Start with an 8mm wrench like this one. I tried to use the closed end, but it was too tight and won't fit, so use the open end to start. Then you can use the closed end to speed up the process if you have a set of ratcheting wrenches like these. These come in handy and I will link them down in the description below. Once that bolt is removed, you can grab a 10mm socket and get to work on the bolt that holds this bracket in place. Remove the bolt and then you should be able to pull the bracket out. Now grab your panel removal tool and use it on the two clips for your ABS line. Then we can move up to the fender liner and pull the connector out, just like that. Make sure you push the red locking tab out first before you try to disconnect it. Perfect. Then you want to push right here and pull the connectors apart. Next, you want to pull the wire away from everything so it won't be in your way as you are removing parts. This part just pulls right out. Now we can begin working on the brake caliper. So grab your 21mm socket and loosen the two caliper bracket bolts. Don't remove the top bolt all the way as you don't want the caliper to fall after you remove the bottom bolt. This could put too much stress on the brake hose, which can cause leaks. And you want to make sure it's the top bolt that is left in, because if you leave the bottom bolt in, the caliper will still swing from top to bottom. So leave the top bolt in until you are ready to remove the whole unit. Once the bottom bolt is completely removed, you can get ready to remove the top bolt. But there are two things you want to do first. You want to give the caliper a twist like this. This will help push the brake pads in just enough so it's easier to pull off the rotor, which will also help a ton when you're ready to put the caliper back on. The next thing you want to do is get your caliper S-hook or whatever you are using to secure the caliper ready. The caliper has some weight to it, so try to get as prepared as you can to make this easier on you. If you have an S-hook, it should fit perfectly into the frame hole right here. My strap hooks did not fit, so I had to find another location. It took me a minute to figure out the best spot since I wanted to make sure the caliper would be far enough out of my way to not interfere with the job, but also high enough to prevent any stress on the brake hose. You also want to make sure you mount it on something that won't bend or break. I first placed the hook right here thinking it was far enough out of the way. However, as you can see, the caliper hung relatively low and I was worried about that brake hose. So I had to find another location. You can't see it right now because of the camera angle, but I hooked it around the upper control arm and it worked great. I'll show you that later. Let's begin loosening those wheel bearing bolts. I highly recommend you spray these down with some penetrating fluid. If they are still giving you trouble, grab a breaker bar or a pipe like I have right here. This should give you enough leverage to break those bolts free. Go ahead and remove all 4 bolts and then we can move on. You may think you can start hitting the wheel bearing off at this point. However, do not do that. You still need to remove the axle nut. So grab your channel locks and start by removing this cap. You want to move around the cap while prying up and down or side to side. This will eventually free the cap and give you access to the axle nut. You can also use a flathead screwdriver and hit the end with a hammer as most people do. However, if you want to reuse your caps, this is a much better method as it won't damage the inside edge. And just like that, the cap pops right off. Now we can remove the axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt, and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it. So I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. Eventually, it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it. Once the nut is removed, you should be able to pull the wheel bearing off. If you can't, just hit it with a hammer or mallet. Let's remove the nut for the outer tie rod. This is a 21mm. Having an impact in this situation helps a ton. You will notice some resistance as the nut gets closer to coming off. Just keep turning. There we go. Alright, here comes the fun part. You need to separate the tie rod from the hub. So grab your penetrating fluid and try to spray around the bushing like this, and then spray upwards on the threads. Now let it set for a few minutes and then we can try to free it. Alright, so I'm going to try something you should never do. I'm going to turn my truck on and turn the steering wheel from side to side in hopes of breaking the tie rod free. You can see right away how dangerous this is. Look how my truck rocks on the jack stand. I did not notice it while I was sitting in my truck, but after seeing the footage, I won't be doing that again. Of course, this part isn't in the camera's view, but you can see me hitting this part of the hub. This separated it perfectly. So I would advise you do that and do not move the steering wheel back and forth while it's on jack stands unless the whole front end is lifted and in the air. This allows the hub assembly to move freely side to side, which is going to be beneficial if you need to remove the CV axle or the integrated wheel end, otherwise known as IWE. Now you just need to give it a couple of whacks and the tie rod is now completely free. If you are just replacing your wheel bearing, you should clean up this area a little bit with a rag and then add more grease to it before installing the new bearing. Oh, and listen to how cheap these IWEs are. You can hear the plastic when I move the hub assembly. Obviously, this wouldn't make this noise when the wheel bearing is installed because they would be locked into each other. However, it still makes you realize why these things fail so often in just about every F-150 dating back to the mid-2000s because of the terrible design and the fact that it's made of cheap plastic. Let's move on. Grab your 8mm socket and begin removing the 3 IWE bolts. There's one. And there's 2. Oh, check this out. Part of the IWE that this bolt screws into broke. You can see it's still part of this bolt. And if we take a closer look at the IWE itself, you can see right here where it broke off. This part is metal, and it still broke. Again, this is just cheap and a terrible design by Ford. Now let me change the camera angles real quick. There we go. Here's the 3rd and final bolt that holds the IWE to the hub. Go ahead and remove that. And now we can move on to that dreaded upper control arm nut. Grab your 21mm deep socket and try to remove the nut all the way. This is possible to do as long as it doesn't separate. But mine just separated. So learning from the driver's side, I'm going to grab the torch and immediately start heating that nut. Once I feel it's hot enough, I grab my 10mm socket for the bottom and use my channel locks to turn that nut, just like this. At some point it may stop turning. That just means you need more heat. And you may have to do this a few times before it completely comes off. So, apply more heat. Eventually, you will feel less resistance when turning, and that means the nut is almost at the end. So at this point, I decided to grab my impact and finish it off. Just like that. Now you can pull the hub assembly away from the upper control arm, and that will give you full access to the IWE and the axle. Then you can pull up on the IWE and the axle at the same time to get it away from the hub. The IWE can then pull off of the axle. This IWE is still good. Compared to the driver's side, I can actually push down on this one with no restrictions. Now let's remove that axle. This is a lot easier to remove than the driver's side because it doesn't have a C-clip on the end. This just pulls straight out after a few tugs. Just like that. You can lift the axle up and then pull straight out once it clears your end link. Now, there is an O-ring at the end that you will need to save. Sorry about the crappy camera work here, but you can kind of see me removing it. And there's the O-ring. Just wipe it off before you reinstall it. Before you install the new CV axle, you want to compare the old one to the new one. If you buy an OEM axle, yours should be identical. Mine is aftermarket, so you can see there are some differences. However, there are two things you want to look for. The first is you want to make sure they are the same length, which mine are. Then you want to make sure the teeth on the inside are the same, which again, mine are. If both of these match up, then you can begin the install. Oh, and the new axle will come with a new axle nut. However, I already bought new OEM nuts, so I'm just going to discard this one. You can start off by wiping the other end down with a paper towel to remove all the old grease and gunk. It doesn't have to be perfect, but try to get as much as you can off. Also, don't forget to clean that O-ring. Now we can apply new grease to a few parts. Let's start with this area here. You want to get some on your fingers and then rub it all around the grooves, just like this. Then get some on that O-ring before putting it back on. Once you have the O-ring covered, go ahead and slide the O-ring onto the shaft and push it all the way back. There's a groove in the shaft that I thought the O-ring sat in, but from what I read online, it needs to be pushed all the way back. If you know this is incorrect, please leave a comment below so I can get the correct information out to everybody. Real quick, this is another grease product you can use if you wanted to try something different. This is a sprayable kind of grease, and it may be easier for some of you with shorter arms that can't reach, or if you don't have gloves and want to keep the grease off of your fingers. Now you want to add grease to the opening of the axle. You don't need a whole lot because you already applied some to the other end, but you want to make sure you get grease into the grooves. Work the grease all the way around, and this is about how it should look. So after changing your gloves, go ahead and grab your axle and make sure you start above the end link and then slowly feed it between the end link and your strut, just like that. Now you can carefully try to get the grooves lined up so you can push the axle into place. Do you see the end right here? As long as it's moving with the rest of the axle, it's not seated properly. Okay, see how it stopped moving? Even when I give it a little tug with my hand directly on it, you can see it doesn't move. This means it's locked in and you can move on. Now we can grab our grease again and begin greasing the teeth at the end of our axle. Go ahead and apply it on the outside as well as the inside of the teeth. Once that's done, you can grab your IWE and place it with the two vacuum nipples facing toward the vehicle. Go ahead and push it on and make sure the teeth lock into the teeth of the axle. Just like that. Alright, now before you push it into the hub, you want to clean this area first. This is full of rust and probably some other debris, so try to get that as clean as you can without spending too much time on it. Oh, and since we're spraying brake clean, go ahead and cover your axle in IWE because you will most likely have overspray. A towel like this will do. Now grab your brake clean and wire brush and begin cleaning the surface. I did this for a minute or two, which is all you really need to get it clean. Also take note, the surface is not completely flat. There are angles, so you need to adjust your brush to get full coverage. Do you see how the outer edge right here is angled down? You want to angle the brush to get this part. You can see how my brush is angled while I'm doing the top part right here. This needs to be done on the backside and the front. As you can tell, it looks better already. Once you feel like you removed all the rough edges and lumps, you can spray it down one more time with brake clean. Then go ahead and wipe everything down with a towel. That's pretty much what it should look like. There will be stains on the surface, but it's smooth and ready to be reunited with the axle and IWE. Go ahead and remove your towel around the IWE. Then you can insert the assembly back into the opening of the hub and push the hub away from you. Okay, so now you need to find a way to keep that hub from moving towards you. I grabbed a bungee cord and wrapped it around the top like this. Make sure you make the cord fairly tight as you don't want the hub moving too much. That's perfect. Now grab your hardware for the IWE. I bought new bolts and a new axle nut from Ford. It wasn't too expensive, and I'm glad I did since one of the old bolts is still stuck in the piece of the IWE that broke off. Now add some thread locker onto the bolt and then thread the bolt into place. Then do the same with the second bolt. Once my arm is out of the way, I'll show you where this bolt is. There we go. This is the top bolt. Now I'll do the same with the third and final bolt. Perfect. Then you can grab your 8mm socket and begin tightening them down, but not too much. Just enough to make them snug before we can grab our torque wrench. Now I read online these need to be torqued down to 133 inch-pounds, while my Chilton's manual reads 108 inch-pounds. So I'm going with 108 inch-pounds for now. If I need to go to 133, then I can always tighten them later. I do not want to risk going higher and being wrong, as this could break the bolts. Oh, and make sure you are using inch-pounds and not foot-pounds. 108 foot-pounds would definitely break them. Okay, so now we need to grab our torque wrench and torque these bolts down. Alright, once those are done, we can start working on that upper control arm nut. You could have probably just done this instead of using a bungee, to be completely honest. This is going to take some effort, but you want to pull down on the top of the control arm. Using the pry bar would make this a lot easier. Then you can thread the nut on. As I stated earlier, make sure you are using brand new nuts. Do not reuse the old ones. Now, Ford calls for this to be torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. However, that would be quite difficult to do since I don't have a 21mm open-ended wrench. So I'm just going to use my impact. I'll show you what to do if you have a torque wrench in a minute. I'm going to use an impact to get the bolt started after finger tightening it. Then I'll grab my pry bar and pull down on the control arm. This allowed me to use the impact the rest of the way. Perfect. Okay, so if you have a 21mm open-ended wrench, you will need to wedge it up against the spring right here while it's on the nut. Then you should be able to use a torque wrench with the socket and tighten from the bottom. I think that would be the best way to tackle that, but if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments below and I'll add it to the description. If you used a bungee to hold the hub assembly in place, go ahead and remove it now. Now you can apply thread locker to all 4 of your wheel bearing bolts. Doing this now helps prevent you from forgetting later. That looks good. Now let's apply our grease to the inside of the hub. You don't need a lot, just make sure you cover the surface the wheel bearing will slide into. And then add some to the wheel bearing itself. You need some around the teeth like this. And also, you need to apply some in the center like this. That looks great. Alright, now change your gloves to prevent grease from getting everywhere, and then slide the wheel bearing into the hub with the ABS line at the top. Now you can begin threading your first bolt to hold the bearing in place. Once that is hand tight, grab the next bolt and do the same thing. Before you get the bolts too tight, you want to move this ABS line up and out of the way. You need to feed it around and under the dust shield. You may need to pull on the shield a little bit to get the line under it. It's probably easier if you feed the line under it before you mount the wheel bearing, but this works too, eventually. Just make sure you push this plate back or else it will rub against your rotor while you are driving. Now screw in the remaining 2 bolts by hand. Then we can grab our 18mm socket and begin tightening these down. You want to do this in a crisscross pattern. So I went from top right to the bottom left, to the bottom right, and finish with the top left. This ensures the wheel bearing is flush with the hub. Now go back over each bolt one more time before torquing them down. These need to be torqued down to 129 foot-pounds, but as I stated earlier, my bigger torque wrench is not working. So I'm going to use my impact until my new one comes in. Let's move on to the axle nut. As you can see, there is red thread locker on these nuts already. Why is this important information, you may ask? Because for some reason, I added more thread locker to this one. I think the heat started to get to me. But you can see the red thread locker in the threads of the nut already. So this is completely unnecessary. Go ahead and screw the axle nut on by hand until it won't screw anymore. Then you can grab your 13mm deep socket and begin tightening it down. You want to use a deep socket to prevent from hitting those wheel studs. Then you can grab your torque wrench and tighten it down to 30 foot-pounds. Eventually the wheel bearing will start turning with the wrench, so grab a stud with one hand as you pull in your torque wrench with the other. Just like that. Now we can move on to the tie rod. Go ahead and line it up and push it into place. Okay, so I'm adding thread locker to this nut, but that's because I did not know these needed to be replaced after taking off, which I had to do later on. So I just wanted to get this on and secure it until I got new ones from Ford. But I want to make this clear, you do not need to add thread locker to this nut or the upper control arm nut. You do, however, need to replace both. The torque spec for this nut is 85 foot-pounds. Now this part is completely unnecessary, but in order to prevent any kind of moisture from rusting out the parts inside, I decided to add some grease around the axle nut. I'm thinking this helps, however I could be completely wrong. So you do what you want with this. Now you can install your cap. Make sure it's as straight as possible before hitting it with a hammer or a mallet. That looks good. I'm going to wipe off the rest of the grease and then we can move on. Alright, go ahead and screw a lug nut all the way on to keep the rotor from moving around while installing the caliper. Then grab your caliper and place it over the rotor. You may need to give the back of the caliper a few jabs, just make sure it's lined up perfectly. Now you can grab your bolt, and hopefully you already put thread locker on it before mounting the caliper, like me. This looks easy because the caliper isn't moving around, but try to remember to add thread locker before grabbing the caliper so you can immediately start threading it in. These calipers have some weight to them. Go ahead and thread the bolt in as far as you can with your fingers, and then you can torque them down to 184 foot-pounds using your 21mm socket. Perfect. Now you can grab your brake hose bracket and put it into the middle slot, just like that. Then you can grab the bigger of the two bolts remaining and add some thread locker to it. Finger tighten it. And then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. That should be good. Next, grab your ABS line and put this part in the hook. This will keep the line in place as you get that 8mm bolt installed. I added some thread locker to this bolt as well, but it's probably not necessary. Go ahead and grab your 8mm socket and snug it down as well. Perfect. Now we can remove any bungees or straps we still have, and then grab our ABS line and first insert the tab into here. There is another tab you need to push in this area, and you may need to filter the wire around to make it work. Then you can insert the connector into one end and then press in the red tab. Once that's connected, go ahead and press those two white tabs back through the other side of the fender liner, just like that. Next, reattach your IWE vacuum line. This should just push right in, but make sure the larger hole and smaller hole line up with the male ends of the IWE. And then you can press the tab back into the bracket. My tab is broken, as you can see, but it still holds. Now you need to apply a thin coat of anti-seize to the face of the rotor, being careful not to get any on the surface that the brake pads come in contact with. All that's left is to get your wheel back on and torque down the lug nuts to 125 foot-pounds.
That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.